Most Americans don't get their ideas about China from history books. They get them from movies, trivia cards, and stories that sound smart enough to never question. This video takes apart 40 of those facts that feel true only because you've heard them your whole life and shows how pop culture quietly rewrote an entire civilization into something simpler, dumber, and easier to digest. 1. Pop culture has convinced us that the Great Wall of China is the only man-made structure visible from the moon with the naked eye. This is a classic trivia lie that makes every kid in history class feel like they have superhero vision. If you actually went to the moon and looked back, you would see absolutely zero walls because the moon is incredibly far away. It is like trying to spot a single noodle on a football field from the top of a skyscraper. NASA astronauts have confirmed that the wall is actually harder to see than a dusty highway because it is made of the same earth as the mountains around it. People love to think the wall is a cosmic beacon, but in reality, it is just a very long pile of bricks that is perfectly camouflaged. You would have better luck spotting a shiny nickel in a dark parking lot from space. 2. Every American child grows up believing that General Tso was a legendary master chef who spent his life perfecting the art of frying chicken in a spicy, sugary sauce. We assume he was the Julia Child of the ancient world, but the historical truth is much more awkward. General Tso was a real Qing-era general, known for his intense military campaigns who definitely never touched a deep fryer in his life. He would probably be deeply offended to know that his legacy has nothing to do with his battlefield strategies and everything to do with a piece of battered poultry that isn't even served in China. It is like if 200 years from now, the only thing people remembered about a great president was a brand of frozen burritos. He was a man of war who became a man of appetizers without ever giving his permission. 3. Most people think that the ancient Chinese invented gunpowder because they were brilliant scientists trying to build the first cannon. Textbooks portray them as master engineers, but the truth is much more ridiculous. Gunpowder was actually discovered by accident by a bunch of alchemists who were trying to find a magic potion that would make the emperor live forever. They were literally looking for eternal life and ended up creating something that could blow their eyebrows off in a second. Instead of finding a miracle cure, they accidentally invented the most dangerous explosive in history while playing with sulfur and charcoal. It is the ultimate historical backfire. Imagine trying to make a vitamin pill and accidentally creating a grenade. It was really just a massive chemistry fail that happened to change the world forever. 4. Trivia myths often describe acupuncture as an ancient, unchanged medical miracle that has been perfectly preserved for 5,000 years. While the practice is indeed ancient, the version we see today was heavily standardized and promoted in the mid-20th century because the government faced a massive shortage of modern hospitals. They basically polished up old techniques and branded them as a national miracle to provide low-cost care to rural areas. It is like your doctor telling you they ran out of aspirin, so they are going to rebrand getting poked with a needle as a high-end luxury treatment. It is not a mystical secret from a mountain temple. It is a clever way to handle a public health budget crisis that Westerners now pay hundreds of dollars to experience for fun. 5. Marco Polo is the legendary Italian explorer who supposedly brought pasta back from China to save Europe from a life of eating nothing but dry bread. Pop culture has sold us this romantic history for centuries, but it is basically a giant culinary fairy tale. Historical records show that people in the Mediterranean were already boiling dough and eating noodles long before Marco ever stepped foot on the Silk Road. The idea that a single guy had to travel thousands of miles just to discover the concept of a noodle is peak historical silliness. It is like saying Americans did not know about sandwiches until someone went to London and saw a piece of ham between two slices of bread. Marco Polo was great at getting lost, but he was not the secret delivery driver who invented the spaghetti dinner for the entire Western world. 6. There is a famous legend that the Forbidden City has exactly 9,999 rooms, because 10,000 is a number reserved only for the gods. Western storytelling sells this as a beautiful sign of ancient numerology. But if you actually go there with a clipboard and start counting, you will find it is a total lie. There are actually around 8,000 rooms, and many of them are just small, dusty closets where servants probably hid to avoid working. The emperor did not even know how many rooms he had because he was too busy being bored in the same 3 hallways. It is a bit sad that we have built this magical aura around a palace that basically just lied on its real estate listing to sound more impressive. It was not a celestial masterpiece of math. It was just a massive, confusing house. 7. History books often claim that ancient Chinese paper money was a sign of a brilliant, stable economy that was centuries ahead of the world. While it was innovative, the reality was that the government often turned to paper because they faced a massive shortage of copper and iron for coins. Carrying around thousands of heavy metal coins was giving merchants back problems, and the local mines were running dry. It was a move for convenience that eventually led to some of the earliest major inflation blow-ups in human history, when the government printed too much of it. It is funny to think that the first banknotes were basically just the emperor's way of saying, "I owe you one." It only worked as long as people believed the paper had value, which didn't always end well for the peasants who were left with useless scraps. 8. Hollywood and pop culture have convinced us that the story of Mulan is an ancient tale of a girl rebelling against a sexist society to find her true identity. We see her as a feminist icon, but the original Chinese legend is much more about being a good, obedient daughter. In the ancient ballad, Mulan doesn't join the army to find herself or break a glass ceiling. She does it because her father is too old to go, and she doesn't have an older brother to take his place. It was about filial piety, which is just a fancy way of saying you have to do whatever your parents tell you, even if it involves fighting a war for 12 years. It is kind of sad that we turned a story about family duty and sacrifice into a typical believe-in-yourself movie. In the original version, she just goes home and puts on her old dress. 9. One of the most morbid lies we have been told is that the Great Wall is the longest cemetery in the world because workers who died during construction were just tossed into the wall like human bricks. Textbooks love this spooky story because it makes the wall sound like a cursed monument of death. However, any ancient engineer would tell you that putting a decomposing body inside a defensive structure is a terrible idea. As a body breaks down, it leaves giant air pockets that would make the entire wall crumble into a pile of dust during the first rainstorm. The Chinese were experts at building things that stayed standing, so they definitely were not using their dead friends as structural support beams. While many workers did unfortunately die, they were buried in actual graves nearby. It makes for a great horror movie, but a very weak wall. 10. The story of tea is usually told as a beautiful accident where an ancient emperor was boiling water under a tree, and a single leaf fell into his cup, creating a heavenly drink. The media sells us this poetic moment, but the truth is way grosser. Early tea was not a relaxing beverage. It was a bitter, grassy soup that people used as a medicine to stay awake or to fix a stomach ache. People used to mix it with salt, ginger, and even onion, making it taste more like a spicy swamp broth than a fancy Earl Grey. It took centuries of trial and error for people to realize that maybe they should not put vegetables in their hot water. We like the story of the lucky leaf, but the reality is that ancient people were just desperately trying to make boiled dirt water taste slightly less like mud. 11. Most people look at ancient Chinese kites in movies and see them as beautiful, artistic toys flown by happy children during festivals to represent peace and harmony. This is a very cute lie, because the first kites were actually terrifying military tools used to win wars. Generals would fly giant kites over besieged cities to measure exactly how long they needed to dig a tunnel to get inside. Or they would attach whistles to them, so they sounded like screaming ghosts in the middle of the night. There are even accounts of soldiers being strapped to massive kites to spy on enemy camps from the sky like a low-budget, ancient version of a drone. It was not about having fun in the park. It was about using a piece of silk and some bamboo to figure out the best way to invade your neighbor's territory. 12. The Silk Road is often portrayed as a glorious, non-stop luxury trade route where merchants traveled thousands of miles to personally deliver silk to a king. This makes it sound like an ancient version of a cross-country road trip, but almost nobody ever traveled the whole thing. It was actually a giant, chaotic game of telephone played with bags of spices and fabric. A merchant would travel 10 miles, get scared of a desert spirit, and sell his stuff to the next guy who would do the same thing. By the time a piece of silk reached Europe, it had been sold 40 times and the price had gone up by 10,000%. There was no single road, and there were definitely no gift shops. It was a terrifying series of shortcuts through mountains where you were more likely to find a camel skeleton than a path. 13. You have probably heard that footbinding was a mandatory nationwide torture imposed on every woman in ancient China. While it was a dark and painful practice, it was primarily a bizarre status symbol for the upper classes who wanted to prove they were so wealthy they didn't even need to walk. Over time, it spread as a way to signal social standing. But for many peasants working in rice fields, it was physically impossible. You can't farm if you can't stand up. It was less about a government decree and more about a toxic fashion trend that spun out of control, because people thought having tiny, useless feet was the ultimate sign of high society. It is like if today we decided that having no thumbs was the only way to prove you were a true billionaire. It was a nightmare disguised as a fashion statement. 14. Textbooks teach us that the ancient Chinese invented the magnetic compass so brave sailors could navigate the high seas and discover new lands. It sounds like a grand tale of adventure, but the original compass was actually a fortune-telling tool used by people who were terrified of bad luck. They used a magnetic spoon on a bronze plate to figure out which way to point their front door or where to bury their relatives so the spirits would not be annoyed. It was basically a spiritual interior design tool rather than a high-tech GPS for the ocean. For centuries, nobody even thought about taking it on a boat because they were too busy using it to make sure their bed was facing the right way to avoid demons. It is the historical equivalent of inventing a smartphone just to use the flashlight to find a lost sock in the dark. 15. You have probably heard that the massive treasure fleets of Admiral Zheng He were part of a secret mission to discover the world or conquer distant lands. History documentaries make it sound like a terrifying military invasion, but it was actually a massive diplomatic and prestige flex. Zheng He was mostly sailing around to show off how much money the emperor had and to get other countries to recognize China as the boss. On one trip, he literally brought back a giraffe from Africa, and everyone in the palace freaked out because they thought it was a mythical unicorn. Imagine spending $1 billion on a fleet of giant wooden ships just to go on a very long grocery run for a weird-looking horse with a long neck. It was not about empire building, it was just the ancient version of a mega yacht flex to make the neighbors feel poor. 16. You have likely seen documentaries that feature the rickshaw as a classic symbol of ancient Chinese street life. It fits the Western image of old world China perfectly, but the rickshaw is actually a relatively modern invention from the late 19th century. One popular account suggests it wasn't even invented by a Chinese person, but often attributes it to a Westerner in Japan who wanted a way to transport his sick wife. It became popular in Chinese cities like Shanghai because it was cheaper than a horse, but it was never part of the Imperial glory days. It's a bit sad that we've taken a relatively new mode of transport and labeled it as ancient Chinese culture, just because it looks exotic in old photos. It is the historical equivalent of future generations thinking the Segway was a sacred tool used by the founding fathers. 17. The media tells us the umbrella was an ancient Chinese invention created so romantic couples could walk through the rain without getting their robes wet. This sounds like a scene from a historical soap opera, but the reality is much more about paperwork and social status. In ancient times, having an umbrella was not about staying dry. It was about showing everyone exactly how important you were in the government hierarchy. There were strict laws about who could carry what color and how many layers of fabric their umbrella could have. If you were caught carrying a red umbrella when you only had the rank of a blue umbrella, you were in huge trouble. It was less of a rainy day accessory and more like a giant floating badge of office that you had to lug around just to prove you were allowed to talk to the emperor. 18. Chop suey is often marketed as a prestigious dish from the royal kitchens of ancient China. This is a hilarious brand myth because the dish is a Chinese-American invention, likely born in the backstreets of Western mining towns. One popular legend says that some hungry miners demanded food after a restaurant had closed, and the chef just tossed a bunch of random scraps and leftovers into a pan and called it a day. The name basically translates to odds and ends, which is just a polite way of saying kitchen trash. Pop culture loves to show people eating it with chopsticks as if it is a sacred cultural ritual. But it is about as authentic to China as a deep-fried Twinkie is to the French Revolution. It is an American-born original that we slapped an exotic label on just to make it sell to tourists. 19. Pop culture portrays the ancient philosopher Laozi as a mystical, floating cloud of wisdom who wrote the Tao Te Ching and then rode off into the sunset. They make him sound like a magical forest spirit, but some accounts suggest he was actually just a very tired librarian who was sick of his job and wanted to move to the countryside. He did not set out to write a world-changing book. Legend says he was trying to leave the city and a guard told him he could not pass until he wrote down his thoughts. He basically scribbled out the foundation of Taoism just so he could get his travel permit and be left alone. It is a bit depressing to think that one of the most profound books in human history was essentially just a really long exit interview for a guy who was ready to retire and stop dealing with people. 20. Everyone thinks the Great Wall is held together by pure grit and ancient masonry secrets, but trivia myths rarely mention that the secret ingredient was actually a big bowl of sticky rice. Yes, the same stuff you get in a takeout container was used as a structural adhesive. Historians act like it was a grand chemical discovery, but it is honestly a bit depressing to think that the greatest fortification on Earth is basically a giant sushi roll. They mix the rice with lime to create a mortar so strong that weeds still can't grow through it. It is the ultimate historical irony that while people were struggling for food, the government was literally smearing lunch onto the bricks to keep the walls standing. It is a bit sad to realize that the most intimidating barrier in history is just a very long, very old cereal bar. 21. History documentaries often describe ancient Chinese cricket fighting as a cute and tiny hobby for children. They make it sound like a miniature version of a pet show, but it was actually a high-stakes sport for the super rich and even the emperors. These were not just bugs. They were treated like tiny gladiators with their own special diets, training regimes, and even silk sleeping bags. People would bet massive fortunes on which insect could kick the other one harder in a ceramic bowl. Stories exist of people being punished harshly or having their careers ruined because they accidentally killed a prize-winning cricket belonging to a superior. It is a hardcore gambling obsession that could ruin your life if your bug had a bad day. It is the most intense version of Pokemon you can imagine, except the creatures are real. 22. You probably think the modern toothbrush is a Western invention from some fancy dentist in London, but pop culture forgets to mention that it was actually a 15th century Chinese emperor who decided his breath smelled like a swamp. He took coarse hog bristles and stuck them into a piece of bone to create the first real toothbrush. It sounds like a great advancement for hygiene, but the sad reality is that people were literally scrubbing their teeth with hair from a pig's neck. It was not a minty fresh experience with a vibrating handle. It was a rough, scratchy tool that probably felt like using a miniature broom on your gums. We celebrate this as a milestone of civilization, but it is actually quite depressing to imagine a powerful emperor standing in front of a mirror with a piece of a dead hog in his mouth just to keep his royal smile. 23. Textbooks often portray the Great Wall as one single, continuous stone project built by one emperor to keep the country safe. In reality, the wall is a fragmented mess of different structures built by different dynasties over 2,000 years, and many of them don't even connect. It's not one solid line. It's a chaotic collection of ruins made from everything from stone to packed dirt and even wood. In some places, the wall is just a series of disconnected mounds of earth that look more like a hilly golf course than a defensive fortification. We like to think of it as a seamless masterpiece of engineering, but it's really more like a giant, unfinished jigsaw puzzle where the pieces were made of different materials, and the builders didn't always have a map of where the other guys were working. 24. The Forbidden City in Beijing is often described as a mystical and terrifying fortress where any commoner who dared to glance at the walls would be instantly executed. While the name sounds like a scary video game level, the reality was much more about keeping the emperor locked in than keeping the people out. For centuries, pop culture has painted it as a place of endless secrets and hidden traps, but it was mostly just a massive office complex for thousands of bureaucrats who spent their days filing paperwork and arguing about how to pour tea correctly. Most regular people were not trying to break in because they were too busy being farmers and not because they were afraid of magic arrows. It was less of a forbidden dungeon of doom and more like a giant gated community where the guy in charge happened to own everything. 25. The invention of paper is always framed as a noble intellectual breakthrough that allowed scholars to write down philosophy. While that sounds very sophisticated, trivia myths conveniently skip over the fact that one of the first and most popular uses for paper was actually as toilet paper for the Imperial family. While the rest of the world was still using leaves, rocks, or just their own imagination, the Chinese were already mass-producing thousands of sheets of soft, perfumed paper just for the emperor's bathroom routine. We like to think of paper as the foundation of civilization and literacy, but for the people living in the palace, it was mostly a high-end luxury for their personal hygiene. It is hilarious to think that the same technology used for great thinkers was also being used to make sure the emperor's royal backside stayed fresh and clean. 26. The media loves the story of how the secret of silk was smuggled out of China by a brave princess who hid silkworms in her giant, elaborate hairstyle to bring them to her new husband. It sounds like a great plot for an ancient spy movie, but industrial espionage back then was actually much more about boring trade secrets and slow economics. The government had strict laws against exporting the secret, and they certainly were not just checking people's hair at the border. The truth is that the technology leaked slowly over centuries through regular traders and people just moving around, not because of one royal lady with a bug in her bun. It is a bit depressing that we turned a slow, natural spread of technology into a weird story about a princess who probably just had a very itchy head for a few weeks while she traveled. 27. The media often tells stories of the first emperor of China as a wise and powerful visionary who united a nation, but they usually skip the part where he died because he was drinking liquid mercury to become a god. He was obsessed with living forever, so his doctors gave him little red mercury pills, thinking it was the secret to eternal life. Instead of turning into a golden deity, he just slowly turned his brain into mush and died in his late 30s. It is a pathetic historical reality that the most powerful man in the world was basically poisoned by his own health supplements. We are told he was a legendary figure, but he ended up being a cautionary tale about why you should not take medical advice from guys who think shiny liquid metal is a vitamin. He spent his whole life building a tomb for a soul that he accidentally evicted. 28. Everyone has seen a movie where a prisoner is tied down under a slow, rhythmic drip of water, and the narrator whispers that this is the legendary Chinese water torture. This was popularized in Western stage culture, including by figures like Harry Houdini, because he knew that adding an exotic, mysterious label would sell more tickets to his escape shows. The depressing reality is that this torture is about as Chinese as a pepperoni pizza. It was a term used to sell a sense of danger and mystery to an audience that knew nothing about the East. It is honestly sad that we've spent decades blaming an entire ancient civilization for a drip of water that was primarily a marketing gimmick for a guy in a top hat who wanted to look more impressive. There is no evidence of this being a standard practice in ancient Chinese history. 29. We are often told that the ancient Chinese eunuchs were just tragic servants who spent their lives being sad and polishing the floors. While many were indeed victims of a cruel system, some of these guys were the ultimate power players who at times basically ran the entire government behind the emperor's back. Because they could not have their own families, the emperor trusted them with all his secrets, which they used to become incredibly rich and influential. In certain dynasties, eunuchs had more power than generals and could decide who got to be the next ruler. They were not just victims of a weird tradition, they were often the shadowy masterminds of the imperial court who held the keys to the kingdom. It is like if the palace janitors suddenly became the board of directors for a trillion-dollar company while everyone else was busy bowing. 30. A favorite story in history documentaries is how the evil Empress Dowager Cixi single-handedly destroyed the Chinese Navy by spending the entire military budget on a massive, useless marble boat for her summer garden. The narrative is that while foreign fleets were preparing to attack, she was sitting on a stone boat eating grapes. It's a hilarious image of royal stupidity, but the reality is much more about political smears and boring bureaucracy. The boat was actually a pavilion that had existed for years, and she just used some renovation funds to fix it up. The idea that she stole the entire Navy's money for one garden ornament was a rumor started by her political enemies to make her look like a historical cartoon villain. It is a bit sad that we've turned a complex woman into a meme about a sinking stone boat just because it's easier to blame her. 31. There is a popular legend that ice cream was an ancient Chinese delicacy discovered by Marco Polo and brought back to Italy to satisfy the sweet tooth of the European elite. Pop culture makes it sound like he walked into a shop and ordered a double scoop, but the reality was much more like a bowl of cold, milky slush. Ancient Chinese ice cream was basically just snow, mixed with rice, buffalo milk, and a little bit of camphor to make it taste like a pine tree. It was not a creamy, delicious treat. It was more like eating a cold, soggy bowl of breakfast cereal that smelled like a medicine cabinet. They weren't sitting around a parlor with sprinkles. They were eating frozen buffalo sludge just to keep cool during the summer. We have turned it into a magical origin story, but the original version would probably just make you ask for a glass of water. 32. You have probably heard the epic tale of the Ming Dynasty's massive treasure fleet being destroyed in a colossal, fiery naval disaster that ended China's age of exploration. Movie scripts love a good explosion, but the real end of the world's greatest fleet was far more pathetic. The government simply decided that sailing was too expensive and that they would rather spend the money on a really big wall and some fancy hats. They didn't sink the ships in a heroic battle. They literally just left them in the harbor to rot until the wood fell apart and the sails turned into dust. Bureaucrats even burned the records of the voyages because they wanted to pretend the whole thing never happened. It is genuinely depressing to think that the greatest navy was defeated by a bunch of guys in offices who decided that staying home was better. 33. We are often told that the ancient Chinese invented soccer, or Kuju, as a graceful and artistic sport meant to bring people together in a spirit of friendly competition. The media makes it sound like a peaceful Ancestors of the World Cup situation, but it was actually a brutal military training exercise designed to make soldiers run faster and kick harder. There were no yellow cards or referees with whistles. It was mostly about showing the general that you were tough enough to keep your feet moving while people were trying to trip you. It was not a fun weekend hobby for the family. It was a grueling drill for guys who would rather be at home. It is a bit sad that we have turned a sweaty, dusty military workout into a cute story about the origins of a game. In reality, it was just a way to make sure the army did not get lazy. 34. Pop culture tells us that ancient China invented the world's first earthquake detector, a beautiful bronze jar with dragons that could predict a disaster before it happened. It sounds like high-tech ancient magic, but the reality was much more like a very expensive game of marbles. The machine could not actually predict anything. It just dropped a small bronze ball into a toad's mouth after the ground had already started shaking. It was basically a giant, "Hey, look down" notification that told you a city hundreds of miles away was already in trouble. By the time the ball dropped, the earthquake was already over, and you were just standing there with a bronze ball and a confused expression. It is a bit sad that we treat it like a prehistoric supercomputer when it was really just a very fancy way of confirming that the floor was wobbly. 35. People think Feng Shui is a magical way to arrange your furniture so that money flows into your life like a golden river. Pop culture sells it as an ancient interior design secret used by emperors to find inner peace and cosmic balance. The sad reality is that it started as a desperate survival guide for people who did not want their houses to be destroyed by floods or blown over by the wind. It was not about where to put your cactus for better vibes. It was about not building your front door facing a swamp that would rot your floorboards. It is a bit depressing that we now pay experts thousands of dollars to tell us not to put a sofa in the middle of a hallway, something ancient people figured out because they were tired of tripping over their own stuff. It was less about cosmic energy and more about just trying to live in a house that worked. 36. The media often portrays the ancient Abacus as a mysterious and hyper-efficient supercomputer that allows people to do complex math faster than a modern laptop. They make it look like a magical tool for geniuses, but it was really just a sad set of wooden beads on sticks because nobody had a better way to keep track of how many cabbages they sold. It was not a grand intellectual achievement. It was a desperate attempt to avoid losing count when your fingers ran out. Imagine having to carry around a clunky wooden frame just to figure out the tip on a dinner bill. It is a bit depressing that we treat it as a symbol of ancient wisdom, when it was really just a glorified preschool toy that grown men had to use because they had not invented a better way to count yet. It was a tool of necessity for people who were tired of doing math in the dirt. 37. We are told that ancient pagodas are mystical towers of peace, where monks spent centuries meditating in total silence to reach enlightenment. The media shows them as glowing symbols of spiritual harmony, but in reality, they were mostly just very tall, very expensive storage units. They were built to hold old books, dusty scrolls, and occasional pieces of artifacts because the temples did not have enough shelf space in the main buildings. It was not a place for floating in the air. It was a place for filing things away where the rain would not get to them. Many pagodas actually caught fire and burned down because they were made of wood and people kept lighting candles inside them just to see the paperwork they were looking for. It is a bit sad that we look at these structures as portals to another world when they were basically just the ancient version of a high-rise storage locker. 38. We are constantly told by history pundits that China was a totally isolated hermit kingdom for 5,000 years, completely cut off from the rest of the world until Westerners discovered it. This makes for a great narrative of Western explorers opening up a mysterious land, but it is a massive historical lie. Ancient China was incredibly connected to the world through the Silk Road and massive maritime networks, trading with everyone from Rome to East Africa. They weren't hiding behind their wall. They were exporting silk, tea, and technology to half the planet while bringing in foreign religions, music, and food. The pop culture myth of the isolated hermit persists because it makes the country seem more alien. In reality, China was a global trade hub long before most Western nations even existed, making the mysterious hermit story a total fairy tale. 39. There is a popular idea that the game Chinese Whispers is named after some ancient secret communication method used by spies in the Imperial court. Pop culture implies it was a clever way for generals to pass hidden codes during a battle. The depressing reality is that the name has nothing to do with Chinese history, and the term itself is now considered outdated and a bit cringy in many parts of the world. Ancient Chinese messengers were actually extremely organized and used a complex system of horses and written scrolls to make sure things did not get mixed up. It is a bit sad that a culture known for its incredible record-keeping ended up being the punchline for a game where people just mumble nonsense into each other's ears. It is a historical lie that turns a sophisticated civilization into a silly playground joke. 40. The media loves to tell us that the Great Wall was a super effective, impenetrable shield that kept the nomadic hordes away like a giant stone fly swatter. It wasn't useless everywhere. It worked best as a border control system and a way to signal danger, not as a magic force field. In reality, most invaders did not even bother climbing it because they could just find a place where the wall ended, or simply pay the guys guarding the gate to let them through. Bribery was often way faster than a siege. Even the famous Genghis Khan supposedly said that the strength of a wall depends on the courage of those who defend it, and he walked right through it like it was a minor inconvenience. We are told it was a masterpiece of total security, but it was really a massive, expensive project that often proved that humans are much easier to bribe than stone is to break. Now here's the uncomfortable part. How many of these lies did you repeat without ever checking? And which one are you still tempted to defend in the comments right now? Pick one myth from this video that you still think is basically true, and explain why. I guarantee someone will be ready to tear it apart. If you like videos that don't play safe with history, hit like, subscribe, and get comfortable questioning the stuff everyone swears is common knowledge.